Pastor Jonathan Keller lived in a world where appearances mattered more than anything else. In his small southern town, the church was the beating heart of the community, and he stood at the very center of it. On Sunday mornings, families filled the pews, children fidgeted in their best clothes, and elderly members smiled proudly at the man they trusted to guide their souls. Jonathan had spent years cultivating this reputation, presenting himself as the picture of integrity. His sermons were filled with passion, his gestures always warm, his voice steady and calm. He was a man who seemed to embody goodness, a man others could lean on when life became too heavy. Yet beneath the polished exterior, his life was tangled with a secret that could unravel everything he had built. Jonathan's wife, Emily, had been by his side for more than a decade. She supported him in every church function, hosted Bible studies in their home, and was adored by the congregation for her kindness. Together, they looked like the perfect pair, blessed with 2 children who never seemed to step out of line. But while Emily believed their marriage was strong, Jonathan carried a different truth in his heart. For 2 years, he had been seeing another woman, one who did not belong to the world of stained glass windows and Sunday school picnics. Her name was Tasha, and she was everything his wife wasn't. She was bold, unapologetic, and demanding. What started as a moment of weakness had spiraled into something he could no longer control. At first, Jonathan convinced himself it was just an escape. The long hours, the constant pressure of leading a congregation, the expectation to always be perfect. It had all worn him down. Tasha gave him a space where he didn't have to pretend. She didn't want prayers or sermons. She wanted attention, affection, and money. The first time he slipped her an envelope, he told himself it was only to keep the peace, to make sure she wouldn't expose their affair. But over time, the envelopes became bigger, the payments more frequent, until they weren't just hush money anymore. They were the cost of keeping her satisfied. Tasha had expensive tastes. She wanted new clothes, weekend getaways, and nights in hotels far from town. Jonathan complied, terrified of what might happen if she decided to tell the truth. He lived in constant fear of his double life being exposed, yet he couldn't bring himself to cut her off. His guilt grew heavier with each Sunday sermon, but he buried it beneath polished words and rehearsed smiles. The congregation saw a man of faith, but Jonathan knew he was walking a tightrope that could snap at any moment. By the time the annual homecoming service was announced, Jonathan had been entangled in the affair far longer than he ever intended. Homecoming was the church's biggest event of the year, a time when former members returned, donations poured in, and the sanctuary overflowed with laughter and joy. It was supposed to be a celebration of unity, a reminder of the church's strength. For Jonathan, it became another source of anxiety. He worried Tasha might show up, that she might be reckless enough to walk through the doors and demand answers in front of everyone. 3 months before homecoming, Jonathan finally reached his breaking point. He told himself he could no longer keep paying her, that the cycle had to end. He stopped sending money, convincing himself she would eventually give up and move on. But Tasha was not the kind of woman to disappear quietly. The moment he withheld what she believed she was owed, she turned from a secret companion into a storm that threatened to destroy him. Jonathan underestimated her anger, telling himself she was bluffing when she sent threatening messages. He was so used to controlling the story, so confident in his ability to manage appearances, that he refused to see the danger growing in front of him. On the surface, Jonathan Keller remained the same calm, smiling pastor his congregation admired. He prepared his sermons, shook hands with newcomers, and planned for homecoming as though it would be a triumphant celebration. But in the shadows, the foundation of his life was already crumbling. His decision to cut off Tasha had lit a fuse he couldn't put out, and every day it burned closer to an explosion that would leave his entire world in ruins. When Jonathan cut off the payments, he believed he had finally regained control of his life. For months, he had told himself that giving money to Tasha was a temporary mistake, a lapse in judgment that he could eventually end. By refusing to send her another $1, he imagined he was taking back his power, putting the whole affair behind him. But what he failed to understand was that Tasha had built her own life around his money and attention, and she wasn't about to let it slip away quietly. The silence between them didn't last long. Within days of the first missed payment, his phone buzzed with angry messages, each one sharper than the last. She accused him of betrayal, of using her and tossing her aside. At first, Jonathan ignored them, convincing himself she would tire of the game and move on. Instead, her anger only grew, and her demands turned into threats. The late-night calls started soon after. Jonathan would wake to the sound of his phone ringing, his heart pounding as he watched the screen light up with her name. He silenced the calls, lying beside his wife in the dark, praying Emily wouldn't wake. But the messages that followed were impossible to ignore. Tasha promised she would tell everyone the truth if he didn't send money. She threatened to post photos, to show up at his wife's job, even to stand up during Sunday service and expose him in front of the entire congregation. Jonathan deleted the messages, terrified of what might happen if Emily found them, but the fear clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Soon, it wasn't just his phone she haunted. She began appearing near the church, sitting in her car across the street, as if daring him to confront her. Members noticed the unfamiliar vehicle, but assumed it belonged to a visitor. Only Jonathan knew the truth. He saw her face through the glass, her eyes fixed on him as he greeted families and shook hands after services. The sight made his stomach turn, but still he refused to act. Admitting the truth would destroy him, and so he told himself it was better to endure her games than to confess. Weeks passed, and Tasha's patience wore thin. She grew bolder, asking questions about the church's upcoming events, including homecoming. She struck up casual conversations with people connected to the congregation, gathering details about the service time and the flow of the day. Jonathan heard whispers that a new woman had been asking questions, but he dismissed them, telling himself she wouldn't dare show up. His arrogance blinded him to the reality that she was preparing for something much darker than exposure. By the second month without money, Jonathan's life was unraveling behind closed doors. He lost sleep, lying awake listening for his phone to buzz. He grew short-tempered with his wife and children, snapping at small things he would normally brush off. His sermons became rehearsed performances, words spoken without the conviction he once carried. Members of the congregation noticed he seemed distracted, but they assumed he was simply stressed from the workload of preparing for homecoming. No one suspected the truth, that he was being hunted by the very woman he once believed he could control. The more desperate Tasha became, the more dangerous her threats sounded. She hinted at things far beyond embarrassment, her words dripping with rage. She told him he would regret crossing her, that she wasn't afraid of consequences, that she would take everything from him if he didn't pay. Jonathan still refused to give in. To him, sending another $1 meant surrendering completely, and he clung stubbornly to the idea that if he ignored her long enough, she would vanish from his life. But she didn't vanish. She watched, she waited, and she planned. As homecoming drew closer, the fuse that Jonathan had lit with his refusal burned shorter by the day. Everyone around him looked forward to the celebration, imagining a joyful service filled with music and reunion. Jonathan tried to convince himself it would be fine, that his secret would stay buried a little longer. What he didn't know was that Tasha had already chosen that very day, the most important day of the church calendar, to deliver the kind of revenge he never thought possible. The morning of the homecoming service began like a scene from a postcard. The air was crisp with the first signs of autumn, the trees painted in shades of orange and red, and the church parking lot filled quickly as families arrived from near and far. For many, it was the highlight of the year, a tradition rooted in reunion and joy. Children laughed as they ran up the steps, grandparents embraced loved ones they hadn't seen in months, and the sanctuary buzzed with excitement. Inside, the choir rehearsed softly, their voices blending in harmony, while women set tables in the fellowship hall, preparing a feast for after the service. Everything about the day carried the promise of celebration, but beneath the cheerful surface, something darker was moving closer. Jonathan stood at the pulpit, greeting old members with practiced warmth. His smile seemed genuine, his handshake firm, his voice filled with the same charm that had made him beloved for years. But behind the mask of composure, his stomach churned. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with worry about Tasha. Though he told himself she wouldn't dare to show up, her silence over the past few days gnawed at him. It was too quiet, too controlled, and he knew her well enough to understand that silence never meant surrender. It meant she was planning something. Tasha had arrived long before the service began. She parked 2 streets away, sitting in her car with her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the church in the distance. She wore clothes that blended in, modest enough not to attract attention, her hair pulled back neatly, her purse resting on the seat beside her. Inside that purse was the gun she had decided would solve everything. To her, Jonathan wasn't just a man who betrayed her. He was a man who owed her, who had humiliated her by cutting off the money she believed was her right. The affair, the promises, the envelopes of cash, they had tied her to him, and now, she saw herself as the woman he tried to erase. If he could erase her, then she would erase him. When the church bells rang, signaling the start of the homecoming service, Tasha slipped out of her car and joined the flow of visitors. She walked confidently, smiling politely when she passed strangers, blending into the crowd like any other returning member. No one looked at her twice. Inside, she chose a seat in the back row, close to the exit. From there, she could see Jonathan clearly at the pulpit, his presence commanding the room. The congregation hung on his words, unaware that the man preaching about forgiveness and love had been living a lie that was about to be exposed in the most violent way possible. Jonathan's sermon carried the usual rhythm, each line carefully constructed to inspire. He spoke about truth, about the importance of living with integrity, about the bond that held families and communities together. His voice filled the sanctuary strong and steady, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward the back rows. He couldn't shake the feeling that she might be there, hiding in plain sight. Every time he saw a movement in the corner of his vision, his heart skipped, but he forced himself to keep speaking, to stay in character. The church expected a leader, not a man unraveling under pressure. As the service built toward its peak, the choir rose, their voices swelling with joy. The congregation followed, standing together, their song echoing off the high ceilings. Hands clapped, feet tapped, and the sanctuary vibrated with life. To anyone else, it was the perfect picture of unity. To Tasha, it was the perfect cover. No one would notice her at first, not with so many people lost in worship. She gripped her purse tighter, feeling the weight of the gun inside, her heartbeat steady with purpose. Jonathan closed his eyes as the choir sang, lifting his hands in prayer. He told himself he was safe, that she hadn't come, that this day would pass without disaster. Yet, even in that fleeting moment of relief, danger was only a few steps away. Hidden among the faithful stood the woman who had turned his secret into a death sentence, waiting for the moment when joy would collapse into chaos. The sanctuary was alive with music, voices rising in unison as the choir led the congregation in a hymn. Feet tapped against wooden floors, hands clapped in rhythm, and the atmosphere seemed filled with joy. To the men, women, and children gathered, it was a celebration of faith and family, a day to be remembered with smiles and photographs. Yet woven into that joy was a silence no one could hear but Tasha. She sat near the back, her pulse steady, her hand brushing against the purse where the weapon rested. For weeks she had planned this moment, and now the time had arrived. The sound of the hymn washed over her, but all she could focus on was the figure standing at the pulpit. Jonathan's voice carried above the singing, warm and commanding. He looked like a man who belonged to the light, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the sanctuary lamps. Every eye in the room was on him, every heart focused on his words. He spoke about redemption, about overcoming sin, about how no secret was too great for God to forgive. The irony of those words hung heavy in the air, though no one else recognized it. Only he and Tasha knew the weight of the truth buried beneath his polished message. Her eyes locked on him, unblinking. To her, every word he spoke was another betrayal, another reminder of the lies he had told. She thought of the months he had strung her along, the promises of support, the whispers of affection, the endless excuses when the money slowed. She thought of the way he had cut her off, dismissing her as though she were disposable, as though she were nothing more than a mistake he could erase. That humiliation had burned deep, and it was that flame that brought her here today. The song swelled, and the congregation rose to their feet. People swayed with the rhythm, some closing their eyes, others raising their hands in praise. It was in that moment, when the energy in the room reached its peak, that Tasha knew it was time. She reached into her purse, her fingers closing around the cold metal. Slowly, she lifted it, shielding the motion with her body, as the voices masked the faint sound of the weapon being drawn. For an instant, she hesitated, her heart pounding harder now, not from fear but from anticipation. Jonathan opened his eyes and looked out at the sea of faces before him. For the briefest second, his gaze landed on her. Recognition flickered, followed by shock. His lips parted, but no words came. That was all the confirmation she needed. The gun rose, steady in her hands, and before anyone could react, the sharp crack of a shot split the air. The hymn fell silent in an instant, voices choked by the sound of violence tearing through sacred space. The bullet struck Jonathan in the chest, his body jerking backward. His Bible slipped from his hands, tumbling to the floor with a soft thud that was lost in the screams erupting around him. He staggered once, his face frozen in disbelief, and then he collapsed at the foot of the pulpit. Panic swept through the congregation like a wave. Children cried, women shrieked, men shouted in confusion as chaos consumed the sanctuary that had moments earlier been filled with joy. Some people rushed forward, trying to reach Jonathan's side, while others scrambled for the exits, desperate to escape the horror. Blood spread quickly across the polished wood beneath him, a stark contrast to the white cloth draped across the altar. Emily, his wife, stood frozen in the pews, her hands trembling, her eyes locked on her husband, as if she couldn't comprehend what had just unfolded. Tasha remained still for a moment, her face expressionless, the gun hanging loosely in her hand. She wanted them to see, to know she had done this. For her, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about making a statement, about taking back power she felt had been stolen from her. Only when the first shouts of "Call 911" filled the air did she slip toward the side exit, blending into the frenzy of bodies pushing in every direction. Outside, the chaos continued. People spilled into the parking lot, sobbing, shouting, their voices carrying into the quiet neighborhood around the church. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second. Inside, Jonathan lay motionless as frantic hands tried to stop the bleeding. Prayers spoken through tears filling the space where hymns had once echoed. The homecoming service, meant to celebrate unity and tradition, had become a nightmare. The man who stood as a symbol of faith and strength now lay broken at the very altar he had preached from. And the woman responsible had vanished into the crowd, leaving behind a sanctuary scarred forever by the sound of a single gunshot. The aftermath of the shooting unfolded like a nightmare that refused to end. The wail of sirens grew louder until flashing lights painted the church walls red and blue. Police rushed through the doors, weapons drawn, moving quickly through the chaotic crowd. Paramedics knelt beside Jonathan, working frantically to stop the bleeding, but their expressions told the story before the words were spoken. Within minutes, the announcement was made. The pastor who had led this congregation for over a decade was gone. Gasps, sobs, and prayers filled the sanctuary as people clung to one another, trying to process the impossible. The church that had been filled with joy that morning was now drenched in grief and fear. Emily collapsed to her knees when the words reached her ears. Her husband, The man she believed had been devoted to her and to God had been taken from her in front of hundreds of witnesses. Members of the congregation held her as she cried, but whispers began almost immediately. Who had done this, and why? Some speculated it was a stranger, some thought it might have been an attack against the church itself, but the truth would soon come to light. Police secured the building and began gathering statements. Dozens of shaken witnesses described the shooter as a woman who had slipped out during the chaos. Though the details were hazy, enough people had noticed her face and her movements to give investigators a lead. Security footage from the church's cameras filled in the gaps, showing her entering that morning and walking confidently toward the sanctuary. When detectives cross-referenced the description with Jonathan's phone records, the puzzle began to take shape. It didn't take long to discover Tasha. His phone was full of messages from her, angry, threatening, and obsessive. There were missed calls in the middle of the night, strings of texts demanding money, and notes that hinted at violence. Combined with eyewitness accounts, the evidence was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, police tracked her down to a small apartment on the edge of town. She was arrested without resistance, sitting silently as handcuffs closed around her wrists. News of her capture spread quickly, and the truth began to unravel. The community that had once seen Jonathan as a flawless leader was forced to confront the reality that he had been living a double life. His affair with Tasha, the money he had secretly funneled to her, the lies he told to protect himself, all of it came pouring out in news reports and courtroom testimony. For many, it was a devastating betrayal. They had trusted him, looked up to him, built their faith on his words, and now they were forced to reconcile that faith with the man he truly was. At trial, Tasha showed little emotion. She sat calmly as prosecutors painted her as a jealous, vengeful woman who had killed in cold blood. The defense tried to argue she had been manipulated, used, and discarded, that her crime was born of desperation and rage. But the evidence was clear. The texts, the gun, the eyewitnesses, all pointed to premeditation. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, her name forever tied to the tragedy that had shaken the town. Even with the trial over, the scars remained. The church struggled to recover, attendance dropping as members wrestled with the shame and grief of what had been hidden in plain sight. Some chose to forgive Jonathan, remembering his years of service and kindness, while others turned away, unable to reconcile the man they had idolized with the secrets that had led to his death. Emily and her children bore the heaviest burden, left to live with the memory of betrayal and the pain of loss. The homecoming service, once the highlight of the year, was never celebrated the same way again. For the congregation, it became a grim reminder of how quickly trust can shatter, and how the image of perfection can mask a dangerous truth. For the wider world, the story became a cautionary tale, a headline that shocked, a tragedy that fascinated, a grim reminder that beneath the surface of respectability, darkness often waits. What lingered most was the silence in the sanctuary where the shot had rung out, a silence that carried the weight of secrets, betrayal, and vengeance. A pastor who had built his life on faith, a woman who refused to be silenced, and a community left to pick up the pieces of a story that would haunt them forever.